Quick note, even if I'll try directly avoid spoiling the actual series, by the nature of the video there'll be discussion about aspects of it as a whole, to get rid of out of context pictures in the background. Before we start on the actual informative content, let me give my own personal context, which you are welcome to skip if you only care about the analysis. On that topic also, please don't hesitate to let me know how I feel about this format, as this is my first time doing it and I'm really keen on improving it for series next to come. As someone who has been a Shounen fan for a long time, having read or seen most of the major titles, Zatch Bell has always been on my watch, especially since I haven't seen anyone say anything negative towards it. And if anything, all I've heard was praise. Though I took it with a grain of salt, considering not a super large amount of people talking about it, as well as the fact most of them probably just had good memories of it from when they watched it as a kid. Nevertheless, I still wanted to give it a shot considering there was a lack of options that I felt like reading, as well as the fact that I knew I wanted to finish it one day anyway. And I was pleasantly surprised with how it turned out, which is why we'll be discussing what made it so good, and how to write a shonen in the Zatch Bell way. Just for the sake of clarity, I will be talking about the manga version of the series, so if I omit some stuff that was present or not in the anime, I am sorry as that was not the version I experienced. Before we start, let's lay the groundwork with a synopsis, so we're more or less on the same page, which I don't consider a spoiler, as it would have been revealed in pretty much the first 5 chapters anyway. Konjiki no Gash, or more commonly known as Zatch Bell in the West, is a battle shonen series that was serialized in Shounen Sunday. It follows the duo of Kiyomaro, a talented middle school student, and the titular Gash, his demon child partner, who is bound to him by a magical book that not only allows them to use tremendous magical power, but also makes them participants of a worldwide battle royale between 100 other human-demon duos for the title of Demon King. Now, had this been released in today's day and age, it would most likely not escape the Fortnite allegations, but for an early 2000s plotline, it did break away from some standard conventions, at least setting-wise. But disregarding the actual time period, let's look at what made Zatch Bell so popular. I broke this down to a couple of sections, so that if you are interested in only a specific part of the series, you can just skip to it straight away. First of all, the story, which will cover the general flow of how the series went, as well as all the aspects that could count into it, such as pacing and plot holes. Then the characters, which will also address some of the other parts that you might have not expected there, like dialogue and humor. And lastly, we will address fights, as even if that section turns out to be shorter than the other ones, it's a pretty vital one in the battle series. Without delaying it any further, let's start with the story. Let's address the length of the story right away. At 323 chapters, Zatch Bell might not be the longest series ever made, while it also certainly isn't the shortest. For a series that has debatably 3 or 4 major arcs, the number isn't too impressive, especially when you consider large episodic sections of the story, which is what we'll talk about now. Initially, Zatch Bell is an episodic series, which continues for a pretty long while, till end of the series if we're being honest, with the main purpose of each short encounter being to introduce a character we might meet later, or to deal with one of the participants in the Demon King War. While episodicity itself isn't a bad thing, for a battle series it does feel more like a negative than a positive, due to an overarching goal that we are working towards, which is Gash becoming the Demon King, an approach to the story which doesn't drive it forward, that being the episodic nature, which pretty much resets the story every encounter, just doesn't feel as rewarding to read, as we don't feel a lot of progress being made, even if it is there. However, while the episodic nature of Zatch Bell is certainly not its strongest point, and in fact is probably the weakest aspect of the series as a whole, as the long-running arcs are where it truly shines, the fact that a large amount of characters can be introduced while still feeling natural ends up bringing the strong concrete arcs that Zatch Bell has, which is what we should look at now. As I said a little while ago, Zatch Bell ends up with around 3 or 4 major arcs, depending on how you classify them. However, it doesn't flow from an episodic series into one with direct course straight away, like Hitman Reborn does. Instead, it keeps the big arcs intertwined with the episodic stuff happening in between them. Perhaps it is this nature of not having one major arc followed by another that makes them more enjoyable to read, as they are not hit with a big high right after a big high. But it could also be that the episodic parts are just not as enjoyable, so the major arcs end up being really good in comparison. Either way, the quality of stuff between bigger arcs is most likely debatable, just on how much you enjoy a story of that type. The high quality of the arcs itself is definitely not. Each of the major arcs that takes place -1 has a big setup that stems from the episodic chapters, whether it will be introducing a character that will reappear later or introducing an idea that we will have to deal with. It is perhaps the setup that allows the reader to get accustomed to exactly those characters and ideas, so that when the time comes to deal with them, they already feel developed and established in the world, which also ends up enhancing the best aspect of Zatch Bell, which are its emotional moments. Since it's been mentioned earlier in the intro, let's address the pacing. Although thanks to the episodic nature, pacing can vary bit by bit, at least for those sections of the story, it usually ends up having a rather natural, if maybe slightly fast pace. However, whenever a character is meant to stay relevant for a longer period of time, whether they're an ally or a foe, they're introduced more slowly in comparison to the quote-unquote fodder. Without going too much into detail on the episodic section, as it is fairly variable, similar to the quality, the long arcs are paced fairly well, usually giving you enough time to appreciate whatever is happening at the moment, as well as still moving the story forward at a pace that doesn't make it boring. The key fact about it being paced well is definitely that it elevates, once again like many other factors, the emotional moments of the series. Although I will talk about the actual story slightly more in detail towards the end of this section. The pacing didn't matter as much as in some other shonen, due to the story not being the key component. Although if it was paced badly, it would have definitely impacted the series in a negative way, so by no means was it unimportant. Since I've talked about them for a while now, let's focus on the emotional moments, which are the highlight of the series. Right from the start we get the idea what series Zatch Bell is trying to be. It's one focused on showing you the most emotional moments possible, and it accomplishes this perfectly. Let's start with one of the things that makes the series so emotional, and that's the art. While definitely not the most conventional art style, and probably considered ugly by a lot of people, it was the perfect choice for Zatch Bell, in a similar sense to One Piece's art style. Because of the simplicity of it, the characters can be drawn and shown much more expressively, which not only enhances the saddest moments in the ugly crying sections, but also the most hype moments, as the convictions of each character are clearly represented on their faces and through their mannerism. It ends up bringing some of the highs that the series has into an even greater state. The emotional moments definitely feel like a key part of Zatch Bell, not only because the author has managed to write them well by themselves, but also because it feels like the story is trying to shape around them, whether it will be the actual fights between the characters, their backstories, or even the story layout itself, which makes sure to put as much focus on the moments as possible. While I don't mean that other shonen don't have those moments, or that Zatch Bell's story is lacking in any way, I think the emphasis it puts on them is different from a lot of other shonen, while of course still being similar to others. On the topic of the actual story quality, it's good but not exceptional. Once again, the episodic nature does mean each small part of the series varies from high quality to a lower one, but the actual major arcs have an enjoyable storyline. However, they're mostly carried by those specific moments and the characters in them. Like I said, while the story itself isn't bad, without any major plot holes that might hinder your enjoyment, Zatch Bell definitely isn't a series that you'll want to read to see the world change or to see the intricate details of each arc planned out. It serves its purpose as a way to get to the goal of Gash becoming the Demon King, as well as a nice way of showcasing the strongest point the series has. And with all that being said, I think with that should conclude this section. For a slight bit of rambling, we know that Zatch Bell follows an episodic build-up to a big arc, which then has a couple of major emotional moments. However, those moments are only possible because of the characters, so let's take a look at them now. While I won't go over each and every single character in detail, as that would probably take up too much time, I think we should have a closer look at Kiyomaru and Gash, since they're the most important ones, before we move on to the general characters discussion. Let's start with Kiyomaru. While initially to some might be unlikable, due to his rather cold nature to both Gash and others, he definitely changes for the better early on. While he has his own struggles that they address from the series, although more in earlier parts, and he is also an enjoyable character that not too many people hate, there isn't a boom factor about Kiyomaru that will make him too memorable in comparison to some other main characters, and others in even the same series. Like iterated earlier, he is by no means a bad character, and his intellect does allow him to have a unique perspective on some story elements and makes the fights he participates in much more interesting, which is probably the most unique part about him in general. Gash, probably more of a hit or miss character, which would be a slight exaggeration as I can't imagine anyone hating him, and if anything, the popularity polls present throughout the series agree by placing him always in the top 3 by current Western standards. The way he acts due to being a child might be unfavorable to some readers, as often is the case with the cutesy characters. Although Gash has those moments, I think in general his characterization and desire to become the Demon King separates him from those typically cute characters who are either loved or hated. He debatably receives the most shine out of the whole cast, which does make him even more likable, probably due to being the most developed. When it comes to Gash and Kiyomaru's bond, while it is there, you can feel it grow, although slowly, with even the humor-oriented chapters expanding on the dynamic through the bickering, it doesn't have any setbacks that could cause the reconnection to bring them even closer than before, which could be because of the general tone of the series, or it could simply be because of author's choice. Regardless, while the relationship is definitely one of the most enjoyable parts of the series as a whole, bringing it to new heights would make the series even better. Due to the episodic nature, there is a large cast of characters introduced all the way throughout the series, and while not all of them receive the same amount of time, which is definitely understandable considering if you wanted them all to be fleshed out in full detail, you'd need to properly develop at least 200 characters, as that's the number of participants in the Demon King tournament, which is pretty much impossible in the 300 chapters the series has. However, the characters who do manage to stay for an extended duration of time have their own time to shine at their respective story moments, while some receive better treatment from the author, either by having the moments be of higher quality or simply being more present. Most at least have a singular moment that allows them to grow into developed characters. As I presented previously, Zatch Bell does follow a slightly more childish tone, especially in comparison to some other shonen, and even more to the ones in modern times, which isn't a negative thing in itself at all. However, it can be slightly felt in the way some of the antagonists are written, without focusing on the villains of the week that have been present throughout due to the episodic nature, as it would be unfair to judge the quality of the series antagonists with them in mind. due to the low focus each of them had, their varying quality, as well as the intended purpose not necessarily being the same as a main villain might have. Let's have a look as to why some ended up being quite weak characters anyway. Zatch Bell, due to only having 3 or 4 major arcs, ends up with the same amount of main villains, with some other minor ones inside the arc itself. Like previously mentioned, the quality of the minor villains is not as important due to their smaller presence in the overall story. The actual big villains, with one big exception, don't end up being too memorable though, partly because of their clear evil ways. Before we move on as to why that one antagonist was the best in the series, let's elaborate why some of the other ones felt weaker, and the main reason was the lack of moral grayness or lack of understandable reasons for their evilness. While having a villain purely for the sake of evil can still make them a great villain, the way it was implemented in Zatch Bell did not strike fear like they should do, and it's at that time they ended up being evil almost for the sake of being evil. Due to the message Zatch Bell is trying to portray him at times also, there was hope for redemption for the villains, which did take away from their threat. While of course, like many things in Shounen, this cannot be truly consistent throughout the whole series, and there were instances where the minor villains outshine the major ones. As a general rule, Zatch Bell villains serve their purpose, but they themselves will not be remembered other than for the emotional moments they allowed to happen. Though a specific villain does go above and beyond all other ones in Zatch Bell, with not only having a well fleshed out backstory, a reasoning for their actions, but a rivalry that has been set up throughout the series. They definitely were the best antagonists that the series had to offer, and it would be unfair to not mention that Zatch Bell can create some great villains when it has long enough of a setup and the will to do so. Looking at a different end of a spectrum, the dialogue and humor in Zatch Bell. As always, humor in anime and manga can be pretty hit or miss. There are all kinds of factors affecting the actual enjoyment of it, and in this case Zatch Bell is no different from the others. This time I'll speak about this more personally, as I don't think there is an objective way to really analyze something like this. But while I do not remember ever slapping my knees to some of the jokes in the series, it did have its moments, and was never offensively bad enough to impact the actual story negatively, even if it itself didn't improve it. However, taking a more objective look, the humor did have its place at certain parts of the series, especially due to the difference in age between the humans and demon children, which worked well to emphasize the levels of maturity some of the characters had. This was especially prevalent when it came to Kiyomaru and Gash. On the topic of dialogue, while Zatch Bell itself didn't produce the most thought-provoking dialogue, as not only was this not expected of it as a battle series, it has managed to make it enjoyable enough so that the relationship between the characters feels natural, and you can feel them grow throughout the story, as well as still managing to convey the author's message, with the help of other writing aspects the series had. Since Zatch Bell dialogue is good enough that there aren't any visible faults in it, but not good enough that it stands out from its peers, there really isn't much to talk about when it comes to it. One of the most impressive aspects about Zatch Bell actually has to be its female characters, which could be a surprise, but considering how low the bar is, especially for shonen of that time, it perhaps shouldn't be. Although the female characters definitely feel better than in an average shonen, there is still a clear distinction, with the demon children woman being written better than the human counterpart, while of course there are exceptions to this rule as always. Oftentimes, shonen either delegate women from fighting or move them to a completely support role, which would be considered fine if they have development outside of combat. However, in many battle series like these, the fights make up for majority of the screen time, which ends up making the female characters underdeveloped, which Zatch Bell is sadly guilty of at times. However, even if it doesn't do every single female character justice, on average, they still do end up better than what I've seen in general, and even manages to create some of the best ones when in comparison with its peers, regardless whether they're demon child or human. However, the characters can't exist without conflict between them, so let's take a look at how they resolve it. Probably one of the most important parts when it comes to a battle shonen. While they definitely can have a focus on other aspects of the series, like the story or the characters, without having at least a ground to stand on when it comes to the fights, it might be pretty hard to keep the reader interested. While Zatch Bell is not a series that focuses most of its attention on the fights, as I've addressed in the previous section, they have been enjoyable and are definitely up to the standard set by other series. So let's see what makes them so interesting. First of all, let's discuss the base of any battle shonen, the power system. Zatch Bell operates by separating the power between two individuals, the human and the demon child. While the latter is the one that actually has the power and is the fighting force of the two, the former is the only person who can actually invoke it, using the book they're bound by, which contains a variety of spells. While there isn't any freedom to actually explore the direction they want their part to take, which is the case in series like Hunter x Hunter, the fact that each fight has to be a combination of two people, while defending their own book, already sets up a more interesting way to fight for the characters. Because of lack of possibility of creativity when it comes to spellmaking, which are made in a different way that I won't discuss for now, as it's a spoiler, the fights have to take a different approach that usually ends up more tactical. While this is obviously a generalization and there are people who brute force their way through, due to a large number of characters who do end up with a large variety of spells, the fights do not flow the same, considering each character doesn't have the same set of tools. That's one of the key parts why Zatch Bell's fights are interesting, as with limited options and not too high amount of brute forcing, each fight does have the potential to contain things we haven't seen before without making them feel cheap or unrewarding, because they have to be achieved purely by the skill and intellect of the characters. Although while the possibility is there, and it is utilized a lot of the times, especially in earlier parts of the fights, the end for some of the fights can be predictable, although this applies more towards early part of the story, and especially for Gash and Kiyomaru, due to the limited amount of spells they have at that point. However, due to a lot of characters being present in major arcs, the fights don't end up being repetitive, as due to a variety of powers, they don't end up flowing the same. On the topic of different spells for characters, this should also extend to different humans too. Although not as varied and definitely less common, the human partners can have their own fighting style too, which sometimes includes fighting together with their demon child partner. It's definitely in moments like these, where the duo works together in unison, that Zatch Bell fights truly shine. And these are especially prevalent in the best moments the series has to offer. While Zatch Bell itself might not have the most impressive art style by first glance, the fights and attacks are drawn clearly, with some panels being extremely impressive. As I said in the story section, the art style of Zatch Bell isn't exactly suited for the cool experience, and is instead really well done when paired with the emotional moments, due to expression of characters. This is also reflected in the fights it has, as a lot of the time it's singular moments that make fights memorable rather than the choreography or anything else, even if it is still impressive. Now, like I said in the beginning, this section might not be too long in comparison with the other ones, considering while this is a major part of the series, there isn't a lot to talk about without repeating the same points, especially since I'm trying to limit the actual spoilers. However, I hope this was enough to convince you that the reason why Zatch Bell fights are so interesting is because of the tactical aspects of each fight, which vary from duo to duo due to different personalities of both the demon child and the human, as well as the different set of tools that they must utilize to win. Regarding the sequel, while this is more or less a review of the series as a whole, I didn't take into account the content released so far in the sequel, partly due to it only being around 15 chapters, but also because the original itself is a self-contained classic. However, for the sake of completeness, let's address some of the aspects now. As I mentioned in the story part, Zatch Bell had a really satisfying ending itself, when compared to a lot of other Shounen series, with most loose ends being tied. The author decided to continue the series after 15 years, which I doubt many of the fans are unhappy about, considering the good sales it had so far. However, since this is a long time, especially for the market like Shounen, which has definitely changed since then, a new standard needed to be fit, in order for Zatch Bell 2 to thrive, which it definitely does try and do. The original Zatch Bell felt like a really traditional shonen at the time it was made, with a large focus on friendship, emotional moments, and in general, more childish tone, which I can clarify doesn't make it bad, but it definitely changed to fit a more mature audience, which seems to be the standard now, considering the large success of series like Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man. While it doesn't abandon the themes it had so far, and you can still tell that it's Zatch Bell with the style of writing it has, it's not the same series as it was years ago. Whether this will end up hurting it or benefiting it in the long term is something we'll have to wait and see, as it is too early to discuss now. Again, since the sequel has such a limited amount of content so far, I will not take into consideration on how to write shonen like Zatch Bell, but let's see how to write one with the spirit of original. So, Zatch Bell, a favorite for many and for a variety of good reasons too. A story with the main focus of showing you as many hype and emotional moments as possible, while keeping the tension low in between to make those moments stand out even more. With a strategic approach to fights that makes them interesting and not overwhelming, and not too childish but still a positive message to convey, here's how to write Zatch Bell, the OG style. Run a villain of the week style for a period of time, making sure to give some characters motives to show up again soon. By throwing sprinkles here and there of a new villain needing to be dealt with, set up a big arc needing the involvement of characters you've introduced so far, be it either by making them fight alongside or against their protagonists. Let the characters battle it out with their own wits, while carefully choosing which moments to focus on, in order to produce the most emotion out of the reader. After everything is dealt with, make sure to give time for the reader to cool off, before repeating the process again, and that's how you do it. Before we finish this section, let me reiterate that summarizing the writing styles into these vague bullet points is not a direct attack on the quality of the story, and it was all done in good hope. With all that being said, this marks the end of the video. Since I haven't recorded or edited anything yet, I can't tell whether this will be too short or drag on, but I do hope it managed to contain most of what needed to be said. Before you leave, let me just ask you once again to please let me know what you think about this format and style of the video, as I'm not sure whether these less visually dominant but longer videos are interesting, and since I've already asked you one thing, let me also ask you what series you'd like to see next, and I will see you all at some point.